So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm the Executive Vice President here at the United States Institute of Peace, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here. Some of you I know have been here before, but has anybody hasn't been in this building before? Okay, all right, okay. We got some welcome guests here. You're all welcome, but some new ones here. So the Institute of Peace does this kind of work around the world. That is, we do research, which we're going to hear about today, and we apply that research to lessons that we've learned in the field. And we do work in some of the places that Susanna is going to talk about here this afternoon, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Nigeria, in Burma, in the range of these places where there's conflict. That's what the Institute of Peace does. The Institute of Peace was founded by Congress 34 years ago. We weren't always in this building, as you know, to focus on violent conflict abroad. And the Congress wanted to have some place in the US government that focuses on nonviolent dispute resolution. So that's what we do. And as I say, the connection of research and field experience and training and policy advice to the rest of the government is what we do. So this is the kind of event that we're very pleased to have here. Susanna Campbell is perfect for this. I mean, she's done research in the field, and she's done work in the field, and she's put it together in a book that we're going to talk about here today. But she's been in the DRC, Sudan, South Sudan, East Timor, Burundi. She's been around the world in conflict zones, which is the kind of work that makes it particularly relevant to us. We sponsored her work earlier on as a peace scholar, which is another thing we do, is to encourage the development of scholars in this field. So this is a great opportunity for us. Her book that we'll be talking about today is Global Governance and Local Peace, Accountability and Performance in International Peace Building. That's a challenge. Accountability in peace building and accountability of local governments for work that's going on in their jurisdictions. That's the kind of work that we've seen is important to do and that she will describe. So, Leanne Burke from the Institute of Peace, she heads up our CVE work, our Countering Violent Extremism work. Leanne's going to moderate. Got a great panel here. We're sitting down front. They will come up here after Susanna speaks. And so I'm looking forward to hearing this. So please welcome Susanna Campbell to the stage.
Hi, everyone. This thing moves. It's great to see so many familiar faces. Thank you for coming. And thank you to our awesome panelists for agreeing to spend this time talking about this topic and about my book, and to USIP for putting this together. So I'm going to give you the brief argument of the book here. There are three main takeaways. First, peace-building performance requires local-level learning, which requires that international peace-building organizations make themselves locally accountable. The current accountability structure of international peace building, unfortunately, does not actually support local level learning or accountability. It is focused on what New York, DC, London, or the headquarter office of the organization wants, not what local stakeholders want. To create local level learning, country level staff often have to go around, circumvent, bypass the standard operating procedures set up to make them accountable to their headquarters. In other words, seemingly bad behavior or rule-breaking behavior may be necessary for good performance. I'm going to walk through this in more detail now. So the basic starting point is that international peacebuilding organizations are actually designed to fail at peacebuilding, because they are accountable to global, not local actors. Organizations respond to the preferences of the people and individuals and entities to whom they are accountable. International peacebuilding aims to change the behavior of local actors, not global actors. This local change is experimental. There's no certainty that any peace-building activity will lead to the desired local level change in behavior, or that that type of change is even possible in such a highly dynamic context. Organizational theory has found that in order for organizations to change changing contexts, they have to have regular feedback from the stakeholders who they aim to change. They have to have feedback about what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. They have to have feedback about both success and failure, not from the producer of the good, such as the country office, but from the consumer, the local level people themselves. So to respond to and hopefully change the behavior and preferences of local actors, country offices have to make themselves accountable to local stakeholders. But to be accountable to these local stakeholders, they actually have to go around, bypass, circumvent, as I said, these rules, routines, standard operating procedures that were set up to make them accountable only to their headquarters. This is the way that these organizations were designed and that they function. So the ability of country offices to do that rests on the innovation, the risk-taking, and sometimes the rule-breaking and rule-bending behavior of country office staff. Now, this has several important implications for peace-building policy and practice. The first one is that the solution is not more top-down accountability, right? So you can't solve this problem of peace-building performance by forcing country offices to be more accountable to headquarters for what they're doing. That actually has a perverse effect. The solution is to actually empower innovation in country office staff and give them time to listen and learn from diverse local stakeholders. This type of learning, this type of engagement with local actors is time intensive. That means that for every dollar spent, you may need more staff hours. So rather than focus just on pouring money into somewhere, you need to focus on accompanying the money that you give. Or else, you're not going to be able to ensure that it is grounded in the preferences of local stakeholders. This is also not about some elaborate best practice guideline where you have some clear plan with these 12 steps that you have to follow that will enable you to be locally accountable. This is actually about figuring out how to give country staff the time, the incentives to understand the local context, to get out of their huge compounds, to talk to people, to build relationships, to get feedback about both success and failure, and to alter what they're doing in response to that. This is my synthesis, and now we're going to unpack it in conversation with the others. So thank you for the opportunity to give this brief statement.
Well, thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you, Ambassador Taylor, for introducing this. I'm really delighted to have our discussants here today. I'm going to quickly introduce each and every one of them, and then we're going to jump in with each discussant is going to give about 5 to 8 minutes of their top lines, and then we'll go into Q&A, first amongst ourselves and then with the audience. So starting with Michael Barnett, he's a university professor of international affairs and political science at the George Washington University. His research interests include the Middle East, humanitarian action, global governance, global ethics, and the United Nations. His current research projects range from international paternalism, the changing architecture of global governance, to the relationship between human rights and humanitarianism. Ms. Kate Savangsiri is the acting deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau of Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, known as DACHA. She has 20 years of international development experience, specializing in democratic governance, human rights, political transitions, and post-conflict stabilization issues. Kate joined USAID in 2002, focusing on rule of law and human rights issues in Asia and the Middle East. In that capacity, she helped establish USAID's democracy and governance programs in Afghanistan and was detailed to the State Department's Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization when it first started up. Mike Jobbins is Search for Common Ground's Senior Director, Partnerships and Engagement. In this role, he oversees Search's relationship with governments, civil society, and the private sector, as well as manages their policy, communication, and development efforts in Washington, Brussels, New York, and London. He joined Search in 2008 as the head of Search's office in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. During his time, he has worked on various governance, security sector reform, and humanitarian programs in Central Africa. So we have an incredibly talented and experienced group here that's going to be responding to the arguments that Susanna set forth for all of us. And so I'm going to first turn it over to the last introduced Mike Jobbins to give our first response.
Thanks a lot, and thanks, Susanna. You know, you gave a bit of my bio, but I think the way that I feel the most personally connected to your book is my very first job in Washington. I was Howard Wolpe's assistant, setting up the BLTP, which is one of the case studies in Burundi that's really at the core of your book. And it's not often that you read a book about something you think so much about, and it's been so important personally to myself, and have the luxury of the book actually being true. And you know, I remember a number of the things in the book, and you describe it well. And for this audience, I think what really strikes me, and you highlighted in your presentation too, is how fundamentally broken in a lot of ways the peace building infrastructure is, in that, you know, BLTP, every organization that you describe in different ways, and Search and in the many places where we work, has done and continues to do some great work. But more often than not, it's despite rather than because of how the system is set up and incentivized. At Search, our approach is to always, first to begin by finding hope, by choosing hope. Identifying, if you look in Burundi, for example, it's very easy back in 2003, 2002, to come up with the lists of things that were impossible. And frankly, an awful lot of embassy cables, an awful lot of UN reports were spent entirely itemizing everything that Burundi didn't have then, and every reason every peace agreement would fail. And when you talk about, you can never go wrong on a global stage by being a pessimist. You can always, you know, and it's only, you can only be a peace builder though if you choose to find what's working. And that lens is so different from how so many of our institutions, governments, UN, headquarters, are always worried what's going wrong or what could go wrong, and too rarely ask what could go right. The second is to, you know, part of our approach and is about how we build trust across dividing lines. Even simple things, you know, in Burundi, the BLTP, as well as Search for Common Ground, deliberately chose from the beginning, at a time of deep violence that was characterized by Hutu and Tutsi divides, to make sure our staff was mixed Hutu and Tutsi, 50-50, and you know, it was Emmanuel and Fabien for the BLTP setting it up. And that goes against literally like every equal opportunity employment thing to say if you have a Hutu in charge, you need to have a Tutsi deputy, or you know, that's not like how bureaucratic HR manuals get written. That's not how, you know, a normal way of going about it from a professional, bureaucratically incentivized way. But in fact, that's the only way to get trust and access across rebel lines, across the military-controlled areas. You know, so even in the little ways, even in that, you know, if you follow the rules, you can, or follow the incentives, you can go wrong quite quickly. You know, and the third part of our approach is really, at Search, is really about changing systems. So working in a way that change can become enduring, that is resourced locally, that it's changed and measured in sort of how social norms accept and shift what's expected and accepted behavior vis-a-vis others in a post-conflict setting. The BLTP was doing that at the highest levels of, and still is at the highest levels of Burundian leadership, Search that's media at the lowest levels of Burundian citizenry. But that's change that takes time, and we live in a world where the grant funding cycles, the priorities shift every year, every 2 years. And you're stringing together, the BLTP has done this admirably, Search similarly over the last 20-something years in Burundi. But you're stringing together in 12, you're running a long-term vision of enduring change about how people think about one another, how they think about themselves, how they think about how decisions are taken in a society, and you're doing that while funding it in 12-month increments. And it's a fundamentally broken funding ecosystem and a fundamentally broken then project cycle and philosophical cycle. And maybe I'll stop in a second, but I think the one thing that really struck me as timely in your book is that we're at a moment in the peace-building field where it feels to me at least that for a very long time we've worked hard to be taken seriously at the most powerful centers of the world. It used to be, knocking on the door at the State Department or the US Embassy or the UN or the British Embassy or whoever. We used to have a really hard time at Search. I remember how many diplomats called Howard Wolpe, Bill Clinton's former envoy, was being told that he was being naive by some mid-level French whatever. Sorry, this is a specific person. Sorry, nothing against it. But and how often we were being told that we were naive, that we had nothing to say, that this is an affair for the diplomats, this is an affair for the armies, and there's not really a peace-building perspective. And we fought really hard as a community, all of us, USIP, with this institution that you steward, to make the field of peace-building one that's taken seriously in a professional, technocratic way, investing in monitoring and evaluation, investing in serious policy papers, and that's incredibly admirable. But at some point, we'll also risk losing some of the soul of the peace-building field that came out of the movement that was really about, and still is about, social change. And we fought very hard to get institutions to take us seriously and to hang our star in a firmament that in a lot of ways is crashing down. And so as we think through, in some ways, of course, we want to maintain that excellence in performance, but in some ways also how we popularize our field is something that I think, and make sure that we don't lose the sight of the people in as much as we try to get the ears of the policymakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for kicking us off. I think you've given a lot of things for others to respond to as well, but I'd like Kate to speak next.
Thank you. So I did not work in most of the places that are discussed in your book, but the parts that resonated with me, so I've spent the past 10 years before coming back to Washington out in the field as a Foreign Service officer in what you call the country offices. So the passages of the book that resonated with me were the ones where you describe how beaten down and exhausted and all the bureaucrats are because they're unable to get out of their compound and they're just answering phone calls from Washington and sending cables. I mean, I think all of us who've worked in the field have had those moments of, I just feel so bogged down by this bureaucracy. How do we actually get out and do that meaningful work? So I think any of us who's worked in that environment very much feels the weight of the top-down bureaucracy that's upon us. But I think it's a different perspective, right, than when you come back in Washington and you see the rationale behind it. I don't want to be obviously I represent USAID, I don't want to be the apologist for the bureaucracy here. Nobody here is going to cheer and rah-rah bureaucracy. But I do think it is important to note that, you talk in the book in terms of the food chain and the need for downward accountability versus upward accountability. And you describe at the top of that upward accountability kind of the donors and the governments. But I think from our perspective, we're not the top of the food chain, right? As a donor and as a government, we are accountable the next step up to the taxpayers and to the citizens of the United States. And that's where our accountability loop lies. And I think it's very easy to say, oh, the big bad bureaucracy that's out there that's kind of nameless and faceless. But when you kind of connect that loop and break that down, I mean, those taxpayers, those are my mother-in-law's friends who are retired teachers in Minnesota, and my mom's friends who are working at cosmetic counters in malls, et cetera. So, I mean, there are faces to that we have to be accountable for. Not to say that the bureaucracy and the structures and the reporting should be as heavy and as tense as they are, but that's obviously the purpose and the rationale behind them. And that, from a donor perspective, is the constraint under which we live. So I think we need to be kind of realistic to and true to that spirit as well. That having been said, there's a lot we do wrong, and I think you capture a lot of that in terms of the incentive structures. I think most people who work in this field, as you alluded to, care deeply about the field and want to be engaged in the spirit of it, right? I think we'd like nothing more to be living in the communities, speaking the local languages, engaging the community day in, day out, and really being very in touch with what's happening on a very granular level. The reality is some jobs allow that and some don't, and to be able to institutionalize some of these changes, you need some of these structures, and so finding a way to do that better. So I first admit there are a lot of things we do wrong, and this book is really helpful in how we go forward. A couple of things I think we've learned over the past decade or so in this field and in terms of moving it forward. I think many donors in this field, I think USAID included, we obviously understand the importance of local accountability. We've developed programs, local works, et cetera, what used to be called USAID Forward in terms of trying to engage more, lighten the burden of our procurement systems to be able to engage more and incentivize getting out and building relationships and making working with us easier, I think is certainly a part of it. Another part I think that I would say, Susanna, in your book is kind of this issue of, upward accountability versus downward. And I think one thing we found is that they don't need to be mutually exclusive, right? And what we really try, I think, within this field, and at least as the donor community, is where is that overlapping intersectionality? And one example, I promised Bill a Ukraine example on this. I was posted in Ukraine for 4 years during the Maidan Revolution and the annexation of Crimea. And we met very often, what a strong, vibrant civil society is there. And we met very often with local civil society partners. And we'd always thank them for their time. But they would always say time and time again to us, of course we want to meet with you because our government won't listen to us. Our government only listens to you. So the only way we get the government to listen to us is by meeting with you. And yes, we can all say that's not the way the system should be. That is a perfect example of the broken accountability systems. But being what they are, what we can and should continue to do as donors and as governments is exactly that, is to amplify those voices, to listen more, listen better, and then feed that. That's not fixing the system, but that's using the system for what it is to amplify those voices and to create that feedback loop. So I think that's a big part of what we need to do within that. So last thing I'll say on this is then going forward, what do we do about it? Right, there are things we do wrong. There are some things we've been trying to get better at. Moving forward, I think the book comes at a really good moment, at least for us, bureaucratically. As many of you all are aware in the room, in terms of USAID at least, we're undergoing some pretty systemic transformational changes. Our administrator has talked very frequently about the journey to self-reliance, which in very simple terms means our goal is to end the need for foreign assistance. It's to work ourselves out of the job. And what does that mean in terms of accountability systems and these feedback loops we're talking about is ultimately we want to be strengthening the local systems, local actors, et cetera, and to work with the country, alongside the country in such a way that we don't need to be there anymore. And I think that's the ultimate in terms of transferring accountability. If we're not there as a donor, right, we'll be there in some other capacity as the relationship transform. But in terms of transferring that ownership completely over is what ultimately we're talking about in this journey. In the meantime, we know that's a long road to get there. Some other reforms we're undertaking that I think is touched on in this. Big part of this, I think, for our partners and others, where the rubber hits the road, procurement reform, right? Like it or not, procurement is kind of the bread and butter of how these relationships are cemented. So we are, and we need to be better at, I don't know about breaking the rules. I think I would say rewriting the rules to make it easier to work with donors and governments, to lighten that burden, to do more co-creation with local partners, et cetera. And then the last thing in terms of going forward is, I would say on the conflict and peace building note specifically within USAID, as we stand up a new conflict and violence prevention office, I think we really welcome these exchanges, the learning from this book, what other panelists are sharing, and thoughts from those of you in terms of how we can be better as we take this forward, as we rewrite the rules together.
Thank you so much, and thank you for ending on that note about more to come, because I think that there's so many different pieces to unpack and how we act as a better community of practice together. So last, I invite Michael to speak.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to USIP. I've actually been the recipient of various grants, so thank you. But I've actually never been to the building. So this is actually a great time for me to be able to say thank you. I also have to begin with a caveat, which is that we agreed that I would go last because I've never been to Burundi, and I actually don't do peace building. But what I have done over the years is I spent a lot of time on humanitarian action and global governance, and many of the themes that obviously Susanna is, I think, very provocatively bringing forward in the book are ones that sort of connect to my world, and my hope is that, you know, my reflections themselves may actually provide a different perspective on the kinds of conversations that we're having today. So just to recap, I think there's good news in the book. The good news is that there are moments where actually peace building stumbles into success. And that, you know, that's another way of saying experimentation. But it is trial and error, it's by hook and crook, and it happens sometimes. The good news, though, is that success is oftentimes, you know, Susanna, I've had these conversations, is really measured in terms of learning as opposed to effectiveness and outcomes. So we can say that it's been a success if peace builders learn. And learning can be if they've learned what they do right, but also maybe what they do wrong, which is important. At the same time, though, the bad news is that more often than not, and this is kind of what we've gotten from a lot of peace building cases, is that you know, peace builders don't actually know oftentimes what they do, it is complicated, which is why they experiment. But Susanna's line is very provocative, which is that we basically need rogue peace builders. I mean, that's you know, breaking rules is sort of like going rogue. And so what Susanna wants is for peace builders to go rogue, which, you know, that may be good if these rogue peace builders have a heart. But I study a lot of places where the peace builders and the peacekeepers actually don't have much of a heart, and they actually go rogue in ways that are profoundly destructive to local populations. So I actually I'm a little worried about the suggestion that peace builders go rogue, but that does suggest that, you know, her central point of accountability is very important. I want to take the remaining minutes and actually just sort of poke at what I think is a real profound tension in the book. And tensions aren't there to be resolved. They're there to actually provoke us in that way. And this is almost it's from the book, but it's almost verbatim from your comments, is that we want peace builders to do two things that I think are in tension. One is we want them to be change agents. We don't want them to put Humpty Dumpty back together just like it was. We want them to make things better. On the other hand, we want them to be accountable and listen to local populations. Right. That's difficult to do simultaneously. It's real difficult to say, I'm going to actually make you change in ways that I like, but at the same time, I'm going to listen to you and acknowledge sort of your beliefs and preferences. And so that raises, I think, a series of questions, if in fact that's an important tension, which I think it is in the book. And the first one is, I'm actually not sure, let's take for the moment that in fact peace builders are supposed to listen to local communities. The big question then is, what role do peace builders play? If that's what they're designed to do, and if the measure of success is to learn, then I think that raises a really important question about what it is that we want peace builders to do when they're on the ground. And I don't know if we have a lot of good explanations. There is one possibility, which is that we don't want them to be change agents. And I just have to say, this is something that sort of I picked out of Susanna's book. On page 121, when she talks basically about humanitarian action and emergency relief, she calls them stagnant actors.
Stagnant players.
Stagnant players, which, you know, I wouldn't want to be stagnant, but I actually think that, you know, this stagnation actually might be a good thing in many cases. So I'm just not so sure I would want to get rid of stagnation in lieu of action. But anyways, there is this question then about what peace builders do. The second question is, that if they are to be change agents, then I think we have to acknowledge something very important. And Susanna has heard me rail on this for a long time, which is we have to acknowledge that peace building is fundamentally paternalistic. It's what it is. And paternalism may not necessarily be a bad thing. Paternalism from an academic, legal point of view is basically one actor trying to change the behavior of another actor because the first actor believes the second actor, if they change, will be better off. So I'm paternalism to my dissertation students. Parents are paternalistic to children. Peace builders are paternalistic. If they're doing their jobs right, they're paternalistic vis-a-vis the local community. And they have to be. I don't know if they can do their job without being paternalistic. That's kind of what they're paid to do. And so I think one of the questions then is, that gets raised by the book is, when is paternalism bad? And what can we do about it? The other question is, do we need rule breakers? And actually, this is another big, we need them to go rogue. And I'm not sure that the incentives are for them so much that they're not allowed to talk to local community actors. They're allowed. It's within their rules. They could use their discretion. But the incentive systems, as you so clearly point out, are not necessarily lined up with encouraging them to go and engage the community. So this might be another way of saying what we really want peace builders to understand is that they have a job to do and they're not doing it well. And the job that they're asked to do actually allows them and permits them and maybe actually stipulates that they must engage with local communities. And then finally, and this is the issue of accountability. And I have to say, I've spent a lot of time thinking about accountability, which for many people is an incredibly boring topic. But one of the things that has deeply impressed me about accountability with peace building, humanitarian aid, public health, any kind of intervention for the local good, is that there is no accountability system. It doesn't exist. And I just want to use this to push Susanna a little bit, because I'm not sure that what she envisions would be a complete accountability system either. Because for me, the ultimate measure of accountability and whether it's going to work is whether there are sanctions. If someone breaks the rules or hurts someone else's welfare, will they be sanctioned for it? We don't have any sanctions. There are no sanctions in peace building. They're looking at Rwanda and Haiti in the cholera episodes. There are no sanctions for peacekeepers. They still don't exist. And so I guess my question is that when we talk about accountability to local populations, are we also talking about giving local populations the ability to sanction those who come into their communities to change their lives in ways that outsiders think is demanded? Let me end there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. And I thought Susanna's book was provocative, and you have just upped the provocative game. So I'm very excited for us to spend a few minutes answering a couple questions. I also want to offer to Susanna if you have any kind of comments back from the first three discussants.
Can I just respond to Michael's last to kind of?
Please.
So this is why in the book I refer to it as informal accountability, right? So local accountability will never be formal because these organizations will never be formally accountable to any local actor, meaning no local actor will ever have the capacity, no local actor other than the host government will ever have the capacity to formally sanction a country office or an organization, right? So this is a field that is void of accountability, which is a fundamental problem, right? But I think that in the way that I talk about local accountability in the book, the reason why it is informal, which means that the organization never actually has to listen to it. But once you give authority to a group of local stakeholders, and local doesn't only mean community level. Local means the individuals who have a stake in the institution that you're working with. So local means domestic, but localized. So if I'm working with the security forces, local means the key actors in the security forces and who are affected by the security forces, right? So it's not only community level. But if you actually give those actors a stake in your project and give them some authority, which means that you turn over some of your decision-making to them, then you are giving them the capacity to sanction you in that they could give you the wrong advice, right? They could take you in the wrong direction. So they can sanction your performance, right? But they can't necessarily sanction you by kicking you out of the country unless they're the host government.
That's interesting. So I'm hoping that we can kind of continue in the anecdotes and experiences part of this. And so I'll kind of maybe turn to Mike first to give us, can you give us an example of where you saw something happening at the local level that you just really wish could be translated to a global level of accountability? Something that was never going to be monitored or evaluated or seen as a success or a win at the local level. But if it was, you would see some sort of change at the global level in the understanding and then hopefully the effectiveness of the effort.
Sure. I mean, I think, it's very easy, particularly when you're looking at things from the sort of the 300, from the global level, to forget that what we're dealing with are people problems. And you look at South Sudan or the Central African Republic, it's very unclear how the crisis in the Central African Republic will end. But it will end with 4.5 million Central Africans choosing to live together in a different kind of way than they do now and than they did before the crisis. And so the belief, it's quite easy to lose sight when you're looking at sort of the peace negotiations at the AU and the interests of the Seleka, and if only we slap 5 more sanctions on these guys, and if only these 5 words were in the MINUSCA mandate, it's easy to get wrapped up in that and lose sight that ultimately people change, public opinion changes, and it's a process of one by one. And the Central African Republic, as one other French diplomat mentioned, it's 2,000 villages, right? And like at the end of the day, we're talking about 2,000 villages, 4 million people who have their views on the country. And so, the input of a woman who, after church, organizes a film screening to talk about reconciliation with her congregation or with her husband's congregation, debate sort of what it means to forgive after the war, what it means, what accountability looks like, accountability in the sense of war crimes. That's something that's not captured. It's something that we've seen again and again. It's not a project. It's not funded by anybody. It's maybe the church gives them a room. And that kind of informal stuff. The guy, one of our colleagues who used to lead our office there at night would show the Mandela movie on the rugby Mandela movie on the wall of the house, at night, and talk with the neighborhood kids about it. And that kind of thing, in one hand, it can seem soft, but it's human, and it's really, it's easy. Even when you look at like the Seleka kids, the anti-Balakas, the kids under arms, you have all these guys talking about what they want. What do they want? These are the negotiating positions. But no one goes out and like puts a radio in front of a microphone in front of the kid and says, "What do you want?" Broadcast. Like in Sierra Leone, they did that. But no one is actually putting the humans at the center. And it's very easy then, if you're not actually trying to throw the rebel guys on the radio and have them talk and participate in a national conversation, it's very easy to say, well, how can we possibly negotiate with these guys? Or what are the incentives of these five leaders? So there's a different level of humanization, I think, that we've seen through our work that really gets lost when you're sort of doing the macro political analysis.
And Kate, how would you say that there are ways within development professionals and others to make those connections more real? What's happening at the very local level and trying to make that a more policy relevant part of our discourse in capital? To make sure we're having that type of, as you mentioned, accountability to the taxpayer, but that eventual accountability is driven by what the needs are at the local level as defined by those living in it.
So I don't think that it's not that these interactions or the very, day-to-day human interactions are not happening, and it's not that there's no transformation at that level. It's just that it doesn't necessarily get translated up, amplified out, and actually, if we try to, I think in some ways, I mean, the best way of representing it is, you read a newspaper story that's an anecdote, and then it's, it's compelling, it's gripping and things. But as soon as you try to move it up and, I think there's this saying that, when you hear about one story, it's a story. When you hear about 10,000 people, it's a statistic, right? So anytime you try to ratchet up or amplify it to another level like that, I think it gets lost in that. So I think there is an inherent, it's just inherent in whether it's human nature or anything else, right? So how do you transfer these very human stories to a policy thing? And I do think it's important to be able to do it in terms of telling stories and telling compelling ones. And I think that's something that as a peace-building community, to your point that the community has come a long way and I think needs to continue to do, is capturing and not only telling those very compelling stories, but also I think something that we've come a long way as a community on is in terms of also developing the evidence base for how that is actually working, if it is actually effective, what's being transformed, how, and doing very rigorous impact evaluations, et cetera, around that, and using that and packaging it in a way that policymakers can digest, and then it leads to either changed policies or more funding. So I think that is something that we need to continue to do better, but not lose sight of the very real human impact.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. One of my favorite quotes from a friend of mine who was in the intelligence community said to me at one point, the plural of anecdote is not data. And I remember thinking, like, that's a very powerful statement. But the flip side is also true. The breakdown of data does not always allow us to see the human sides of each and every statistic. So I think there's a lot there that we can be learning from both the top down and then bottom up. So I won't put you on the spot with anything at the local level evidence, but I would love for you to unpack a little bit more of what Susanna's response was to you on what are informal sanctions that actually can change behavior. So if we're thinking about informal accountability, what are informal sanctions that might be able to help us in this space?
Yeah, no, two things first. I think one is that Susanna has put forward, I think, what are exactly the important issues that we need to be having a conversation about. So it's an important book. The informal versus the formal, though, I think is actually challenging. And I think, part of what I hear in Susanna's response is that, if you're looking for that kind of accountability system, Michael, you're not going to get it. And that at the end of the day, what we're hoping is, in fact, that individuals who occupy these roles on the ground actually have a sense of professional responsibility, and that they have a very clear idea about what their role is, and that one of the things that we know is that there should be peer groups around them at that sort of level of authority in the field office that support them and actually give them encouragement to do these things, because we know that actually is a very important element for keeping people accountable, and that there also be then at the upper levels of the food chain that there be individuals who understand what that professional role is and what it means to be a successful and professional peace builder, which is partly why I say, what role are we expecting the peace builders to play? Because I think contained within Susanna's book is actually a very detailed and very ethnographic study about, and I think she could probably identify it, when peace builders are doing the right thing and what they're doing. What are those practices that they should be doing when we think that they should be having that discretion? I do think, though, that there has to be some mechanism for accountability. I don't know if it's accountability for, let's say, the irritants or programming gone wrong or things like that. But what we do know, I think at this point, or we should know at this point, is that accountability on the big issues, on the human rights issues and so on, have to be in place so that there are mechanisms, there are channels by which these can be reported up and around and make sure that action has taken place. And for me, the problem is in a lot of these big, whether it's the aid agencies or in the UN, is that the people who actually end up doing the most harm are never punished for what they do. And in fact, what happens is they're oftentimes then moved to a different location. That shouldn't happen. And we can put the mechanisms in place. It's not difficult. We do it in this country. It just has to be done at the global level.
Well, I want to make sure that we're leaving time for the audience to ask questions. And so maybe we'll start taking them in rounds of 2 to various panelists. And so there will be folks who are coming around with microphones. And so right here in the first row, third row, sorry.
So 2 points. I think this is pie in the sky. And I would say first because to break the rules requires courage. And if you have courage, you can't be part of the system. You have to trade in your courage for cowardice to get inside. They might as well put a note, nobody with courage need apply. But I would make a concrete example. Are you willing to break the rules in the institution that you're part of? Academia, as the beating heart of the idiocracy, is fundamentally obsolete. It's what the Catholic Church was when Luther showed up, and we're due for another complete reimagining of a system that takes fairly smart people and destroys their imagination. So if you change the rules in your institution within the next year or so, I'll buy into this.
Excellent.
Hi, my name is Jessica Trisco-Darden. I'm a Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And while I don't disagree with this gentleman, I will raise a different point. And so 2 things that haven't been mentioned are, one, the international legal system and the role of the international legal system in limiting or empowering various actors. So for example, we know that different NGOs are able to operate differently and interact with different populations based on international legal norms in the countries funding their work. But another issue that hasn't been mentioned is the kind of industrialization of peace building and kind of the expansion of aid and development more broadly into an industry. And so I was not able to find Search for Common Ground's annual operating budget, but I know that similar organizations have budgets, upwards of $250 million a year. These are very large and very powerful organizations. Even when they aim to do important on-the-ground localized work, they're also part of a very complex international legal and organizational landscape. And so when we're talking about local actors, my understanding based on Dr. Campbell's research is that we're not in fact talking about foreign NGOs, that we're really talking about empowering individuals from local communities. And so I was wondering if you could speak more to that differentiation.
Okay, we'll start with those 2, and then we'll keep going.
So I'm going to take the opportunity also to respond to a couple things here that I wanted to as well. So I think one of the biggest challenges in peace building is that failure is likely, right? And so if you're reporting to Congress and you're like, hey, we're doing all this peace building work and we expect to fail 75% of the time, right? That reduces the incentives to actually be accountable for outcomes and increases incentives to be accountable for deliverables. Well, I spent the money in the right categories of the budget on time with the right people in the procurement system, right? So there's something about what does peace building require in terms of accountability. Because the system, all international aid systems have shifted toward compliance-focused accountability, right? Which means doing what the accountants want. That is the primary measure, right? And then results, hopefully. But the real question is, are we going to get a bad audit? That's the real risk. And so I think that while we need to be concerned about being accountable to taxpayers, I think that the taxpayers are kind of out of the loop of this conversation. And maybe if the taxpayers were really brought into the loop, right, then maybe the conversation and the accountability system could be shifted to take on more of a human dimension. I mean, if we're really going to close the circle, what does that look like? One other point. I think that, this kind of lost in translation ladder of abstraction thing is really interesting, right? Is that, something that makes sense at the country level, you talk to one person, right? And you get a sense of what's going on. You hear about 1,000 battle deaths, you're not able to internalize it, right? And as somebody who reported on battle deaths when I was a UN staff person, even in Burundi, I know what that feels like. So what do you do if your accountability system and your real measures are abstracted and synthesized at headquarters in DC or whatever else? You're always going to make things or take things to a level of generalization that loses the real human element, right? And so the only solution that I know in that sense is to actually trust country staff more. To say that we'll accept that the only people who can really interpret and understand what's going on is the people at the country level who can connect to that human element. That requires delegating a lot of authority within the organization itself to those country level staff. One last point. I think that the question of is bad behavior always a good thing is still an open question, right? In the book, I talk about bad behavior that leads to informal local accountability. But I've also worked with lots of rule breakers who are not necessarily doing good. And so the question, and Chuck Cole and I are working on this as well, is how actually this kind of rule-breaking behavior can be constructive and destructive, and under what conditions.
Cool. Maybe I'll take some of the questions about sort of the role of international NGOs and international civil society groups. First of all, our Search's annual budget is definitely not anywhere close to the number you cited, although perhaps some of our board might wish it were. But the truth is, I mean, I think it's a real question about the role that international organizations play within the environment of every community or institution, as you cite. Search, we have about 750 colleagues around the world. About 95% are people working in their home country. And we're very conscious that we're an international group registered in the US, but we're not, just as the UN is based in New York, we're based here. But we're not any more an American NGO than we are a Belgian or a Congolese or a Yemeni in the sense that that's where we are, that's who our people are as well. But there's a role for, and there's a role for locally registered peace-building organizations, there's a role for unregistered, there's a role for individuals. But the thing, what struck me is, there's an often an awful lot of local knowledge and wisdom that doesn't get brought to bear. Whether that's because it's with women's organizations and they never got a chance to read and write in that society, or because they weren't legally incorporated, whether that's with religious institutions, whether that's with just individual entrepreneurs. And there's an awful lot of wisdom, but there's often an awful lot of need for creativity to solve new problems. Every conflict that we deal with is a new one. There's wisdom for how people have dealt with crises in the past in Burundi before this war. This wasn't the first, but it was a new one. And it created, some of them were some old solutions, some of them were new solutions. They're created, some of them were things that people had thought about in Liberia and shared to the Burundians. And so it's a creative process, and one where we have 1,200 partners, all of whom have a different kind of role, most of whom are from those societies, and it's a creative process. I think just to your question sort of about sort of the international bureaucratization of this whole enterprise and sort of the bureaucratization of do-goodery around the world. I think with USAID reform and other kinds of efforts, I think it's a very ripe time to ask questions about how the whole infrastructure exists, how we, on one hand, balance the legitimate interests of taxpayers with the need to not only be accountable to people because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the more effective thing to do in the communities where we work around the world. We're, post-Seeger in Afghanistan and all that, we're in an age where there's a strategy of sort of minimizing fraud by maximizing waste. And so we have a system that's built and piled on layers of accountancies and layers of approvals and things like that to prevent fraud, to prevent wrongdoing, which is good, but also comes with a cost. And so I think there's a lot of time, there's a lot of ways that we can reevaluate. It's something that we certainly can improve. And I guess maybe just the last, to get another round of questions, is that with any one of these conversations, it's super important to think about how we can do better. But there's a danger of also being a little bit solipsistic. I've worked in and out of Congo now for 15 years, and I was talking to a UN guy who said, wow, gosh, like, Search has been working there for 10 years, you've been working there for 15. You must feel really stupid that there's not peace in Congo. And, like, fair enough. Like, there's a million things I wish I did better in my own life. There's a million things I wish Search had done better, and there's a million things we learned. But, like, I mean, how much have we spent in terms of peacekeepers? How much have we spent in terms of like, how much did we do on the minerals trade? There's an awful lot of great big forces at play in any one of these places. We can play our role, play all of our cards perfectly, and there's 20,000 other cards out there that are getting played at the same time. And so, we have to play our cards perfectly. We could also use a couple more cards.
We'll take a few more. Gentleman over here.
Thank you. I'm Dan Whitman at American University. I used to work in the Granite Building across the street. Paternalism, thank you so much for raising that. Yesterday, John Mearsheimer, not my favorite person, gave a comment at CSIS saying, we're overextended, don't get involved. You're familiar with the Mearsheimer narrative. And he said, among other things, don't try to redo other people's culture. It's arrogant. Now, I couldn't accept that statement. My question to you is, how would you answer that argument? We're talking in some cases about communities that are dominated by a handful of elders that tell women when they can and cannot leave the house, that do not permit girls to be in school. I mean, how do you answer the argument that it's arrogant to tell other people how to change their cultures?
Gentleman right here.
Hi, Carl Gollivan. I'm a retired special agent, U.S. Customs Service. I was a 9/11 responder, and in 1995, a sanctions monitor in Macedonia for 6 months with OSCE. And when we speak of accountability, one can't have accountability without an honest unit of account. And the gentleman from George Washington mentioned the word caveat, and it immediately brought to mind one of the most important things I've ever read, and I'd like to give three texts as references. A caveat against injustice or an inquiry into the evils of a fluctuating medium of exchange, by Roger Sherman. He wrote that in 1752. It provided the foundation for our honest constitutional monetary system. Second, A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Goodson. And last, Confessions of an Economic Hitman by his name's slipping my mind right now, John Perkins. And collectively what these point to is when we abandoned our obligations under the Bretton Woods Agreement, 1971 ultimately, we lost accountability to an honest monetary unit internationally. And my question would be whether we really would benefit from a new geopolitically neutral Bretton Woods Agreement. And the only geopolitically neutral place in the world I know to base something out of that from is Iceland, actually. Because it's the differential inflation of two or more systems of credit that facilitate the theft of wealth from countries through, those inflations of currency. Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to actually take one more question. So the woman over there.
Thank you. My name is Ljubica Nikolic, and I'm a graduate student at the School of International Service at American University. So my question is, given that a lot of the international organizations, states, and institutions have this top-down approach and have had it for so long, how do you see them gaining trust with the local community in order to change that?
Okay, great. So maybe we'll take those, and if we have time, we'll take more. If not, we invite you to ask questions when we go out to the reception.
Am I starting?
Anyone's welcome to start.
The last one might have been for you. What do you think?
Yeah, I can talk about that, or Professor Whitman's culture. Yeah, I mean, I think, to come maybe first to the question of culture and then to international, because I think in some ways it's linked. Culture is something that's constantly shifting. It's not static in any society, and in a lot of ways it's shifting more now than it ever has before. And certainly people who declare themselves sort of rulers of culture are often just sort of simply the rulers of the place where they're dictating about. I think, but to concretely with Search for Common Ground, at least our approach is that it's really not about, it's not about arrogant bossing people around or paternalism in that sense, so much as about voice. So if you run a participatory theater, you run a theater play and that mocks out a child marriage, for example, in a village, it's a fictional play, and then you play it out as a hypothetical scenario and have a conversation, not this is good, this is bad, this is appropriate, this is inappropriate, but say, here's a play, let's have a conversation. There's that culture changes not through telling people that your culture is right or wrong. It's about giving people a chance to express their views on a common playing field. And when a young girl gets up in front of 200 of her villagers and say, this has to stop, not because anyone told her to, not because everyone even said, let's get together and talk about how bad this is, but just because you gave everyone a chance to talk. Culture changes because the culture is every bit hers as it is someone who has a different perspective. And then to the question about how global institutions can sort of gain the trust from the grassroots, I would say two things. One is listening is key. There's some UN. If you look at the peacekeeping missions around the world, some of them have public approval ratings of like 17%. Right, and it's not, and someone was saying, well, they should really be investing more in strategic communications and PR. And it's like, the last thing, they hate you. Like, they don't want to listen to what you have to say. Like, it's not about PR, it's about, like, you need to get out there and listen to the people. Like, no one wants to, when and the global institutions, I think, could do an awful lot more in many ways of listening to people. But they have a role as well. These are creative problems, and as much as sort of grassroots peacebuilding had a huge impact in Burundi, it wouldn't have been possible without some of the international architecture within which they're working. And so there's a need for both sort of, there is a need for bottom-up solutions, but it's about sort of where the top-down approaches can sort of sync up.
Yeah, I just add briefly on that one, I think I couldn't agree more in terms of listening. I think the other thing to note is also, in terms of, as far as international organizations that work in many of these settings, the vast majority of organizations actually employ local staff in the places where we work. And I think that's a really important, so I always hesitate with these conversations because we say global, local, as if they were, kind of neatly defined without really unpacking, what does local mean, who are the different actors, et cetera, and all the globe, because I think there's a lot more crossover. And I think it's really important to look at that in terms of an international organization actually empowering your local staff within many of these countries that we work to be some of those key decision makers. And I think that's part of what Susanna is saying in terms of decentralizing authority to the field. That also means that field staff isn't all from the international headquarters as well. So I think that's one component of it. I think talking about if you think talking about accountability is boring or bureaucracy is boring, talk about HR personnel system. I think everyone goes to sleep immediately, but I think that's really at the core of a lot of this in terms of incentivizing systems, in terms of who are peace builders, hiring the right people, retaining, training, giving incentive structures, and empowering the type of people who need to be making these decisions. So a plug for more boring stuff on that. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of the question on culture and arrogance, I think it's something we've all, as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal 20-something years ago, right? That's the question you get as soon as you walk in is like, what are you doing, trying to change us? Who are you, blah, blah, blah. But I think we need to own the fact that if you're working in this field, you're fundamentally talking about change. And yes, there are ways to do it in ways of, leveling playing field, giving voice, giving representation. It's not imposing an external outside views, but there is an element to picking winners and losers. Which voices are we trying to amplify? Which voices are we trying to muffle? There are kind of international norms that many abide by, et cetera. So I think we need to really be honest with ourselves on that as well, because if we're working as a peace building community somewhere, we fundamentally believe there's something that needs to be changed there. So.
Yeah, so I'm not going to defend academia. I agree with everything you say, and that's why I like it. On this question of IO and account, one of the questions I think fundamentally in terms of the law is, and this goes more to international organizations, although it could increasingly be applied to international non-organizations, is that a lot of them, especially on the international organization front, have immunity, legal immunity. Try piercing that. The Haitians tried to pierce it with the UN, and the federal court in New York said no. So this is a real problem. And then the question is, if you can't actually hold them accountable by virtue of the courts or the law, then how do you do it? And maybe that says that we have to figure out ways to pierce legal immunity to hold these institutions accountable. But it does suggest that there may be a role for the law as we've seen in other areas of, let's say, human rights. To your, I'm not going to support, I can't support Mearsheimer. It's just part of my religious oath. But I think, it's real easy. It's a real easy kind of throwaway. Well, we shouldn't change people, which who's going to really disagree with that? Okay, but then I'll get to that in a second. But I think part of it has to do with what is it we mean. And there's a huge difference between, let's say, something on the order of responsibility to protect, which is to stop a genocide, and then other things that are more forcible interventions that are designed to actually do nation building. And we need to differentiate between the two. And there's actually then a whole range, including, which is what I hear you saying in terms of promoting, let's say, human rights change. And the question is sort of how you do it. And the one thing I think we do know at this point is that imposition doesn't work. And that what we've seen, going in and telling mothers that submitting their girls to FGM means that they're evil is actually not really a great way to convince a community to undertake a cultural change. That rather it has to be undertaken with a form of, with basically sitting down and persuasion. And that's frustrating, but that takes time. The last thing I do think that, it has to do with sort of what kind of mechanisms are you going to play? And the more forcible and coercive it is, less likely it's going to stick. We know that. The last thing I just sort of raise as a sort of insight from the humanitarian community, which actually wrestles with a lot of the same issues, questions of accountability, efficiency, and things like that. There's been a move over the last several years to move to cash transfers. Just basically, I don't want to say it's basically giving people money, but in many cases, that's what we're talking about. And, there's going to be some fraud in some ways, but, guess what? A lot more money gets to the people than when they go through the bureaucratic chain, starting with, the U.S. government and moving through the layers of the bureaucracy. And this is and we're finding that it's, under certain conditions, it's pretty effective. I don't know if there's something like that for peace building. I know it's a much more complicated animal. But it does suggest that and the thing I actually find, I'm not a big, I don't want to sound like I'm celebrating markets, but actually giving people money, so that they can actually make decisions for themselves about what they think is important is actually kind of liberating. And that calls for a whole change in the way we think about our obligations to others.
Susanna, can I
Right.
give you last word?
Excellent comments, everyone, first.
I think, the question is what is the equivalent of cash transfer for peace building? And I think the equivalent of cash transfer for peace building is cash transfer, actually. Because there is no replacement for that, right? In the sense, the equivalent of cash transfer for peace building would be attaching some informal local accountability to some cash transfer, right? Meaning that if you're doing peace building work that is focused on socioeconomic development outcomes, right, then think about what is the peace building component, what is the kind of social change component that you're trying to actually accomplish in addition to giving people money. But a lot of the kind of hardcore development people would say, that's just good community level development. Why is that peace building, right? This is what we've been doing and trying to do for many years, so what's new here? And in essence, it's not new.
Exactly.
It's responding to the same problem, right? And with the same system. So cash transfers are a great idea. I think that in some ways they haven't been done to the scale to where we really know what's the kind of bad side of that as well. And how does that feed into the existing incentive structures. I want to say something. Look, Mike, when you were talking about voice, I thought this was really important because the work that I observed of Search for Common Ground in Burundi that was the most powerful was actually the work that gave Burundians voice, right? It was the creation of Studio Ijambo, which was a radio station that trained essentially a couple of generations of Burundians that actually were key counterpowers to the government, even in the most difficult time. And so I think there's this sense of almost getting to the heart of what peace building is, that as peace building has become bigger and professionalized and it's kind of everything and nothing at the same time, that we lose what the point is, right? And I think that Serge has kept that in mind in the work that I've seen very clearly. This is about voice, this is simple, this is about listening. And that, for me, is one of the main messages here, that in some ways, although our discussion about my book and this research may seem kind of pessimistic, it's actually hopeful. Amazingly, sometimes this works. Wow. Because look at all of these things going against it. And it works when you give people voice, and the right people. And that's not going to be everybody. And maybe that is about change, right? But you're already kind of there. So if you're there and you're not trying to change the system, then you're supporting the system, right? So what's the counterfactual there? Maybe you shouldn't be there. But the people that I know, like the APRODH, the human rights organizations in Burundi who have been fighting for their life, they need that support, right? That is about supporting a set of norms and foreign policy, a foreign policy agenda that are at the basis of at least the United Nations and a lot of what foreign aid was about. So I think that you do have to accept that this is a change agenda, and then ask whether you're achieving it or not and why. So just being there and not trying to change can actually do a lot more harm than not being there to begin with. And I also think that the point of my work that I didn't even talk about was that money matters, right? That this is about when peace-building organizations learn and are likely to actually achieve their outcomes, more likely to achieve their outcomes because of that learning, it's because there's this alignment between the top-down and bottom-up. Because you have local level feedback where people are actually empowered to make decisions about what the organization is doing, thus giving them some sanctioning capacity, and because peace building is a priority. So the information that is paid attention to is information that's relevant to peace building aims. If you want to have humanitarian aims, then humanitarian aims need to be the priority. That it's all about what the incentive structure is for that particular office. And so therefore you can't do everything at the same time. You need to decide what information you're going to listen to and what type of action you're going to take. And so that's the role of the top-down piece, is to be super clear about what it wants and why.
I would just like to thank you, Susanna, and just actually, the book is currently sold out, but hopefully to be in reprint. And so for those of you who haven't had an opportunity to buy it and read it, please do so. You will be thought-provoked at the very least. But thank you so much. Thank you so much to everybody who has joined me on stage. We here at USIP have been delighted to host this conversation, and we hope that those of you who had questions that weren't able to be answered, that you come up to the various discussants and have more of a conversation as we move to a reception. There are folks that are going to help lead us the way out at the top of this auditorium and out to a reception. So thank you so much for joining us, and please join me in